Thank you. Frank's right. I did have a somewhat unusual path to GW. I was very pleased to hear General Powell talk about his poor academic path. I think I can outdo him. My grades were even worse than his. I had I failed out of high school. I failed out of college. I eventually came back to high school and got what's called a GED, an equivalency degree, but I ended up with a 1.8 grade point average. In college, I had a 0.0, which is pretty bad. And I worked as a bicycle messenger until I was 25 and played in punk rock bands in Washington, D.C. At the age of 25, I suddenly one day woke up and I was coming home from my job as a bicycle messenger, and I stopped at a drugstore to get get toothpaste or something, and I picked up a book of crossword puzzles, and took it home, and was doing some crossword puzzles on the kitchen table, and I thought, what am I doing? I've never done this before. Why did I buy a book of crossword puzzles? And then I realized I was bored. I was suddenly ready at the age of 25 to use my brain. And the next thing I did is at this point, everyone had given up on me academically, and so I couldn't sort of publicly say that I was ready to go to school. So I applied to night school at George Washington, and part of the adult program, it was relatively easy to get in. And I waited until I got a full year worth of credits worth of straight A's before I told my parents that I was ready to go back to school. And GW let me back into the degree program, and here I am today. And I like to think that I'm an inspiration to parents of troubled children everywhere. That said, I don't think that, I realize that America is full of examples of people who dropped out of college and then went on to found Facebook or Google or Microsoft or Apple. America's also full of people who dropped out of college who went on to live under a bridge. So I wouldn't suggest that there's a direct correlation between those two. But America is the land of second chances, of third chances, of fourth chances. I took them all, and I'm here, but George Washington in particular gave me the opportunity, didn't judge me on my non-traditional past, and gave me an opportunity to restart my life, and inspired me to that I could do anything. So what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit of non-traditional paths, but in particular, it's the subject of my next book, and it's something that I've been working on for a few years. And I'm going to summarize it. I'm going to try to keep words off the screen, but there's one slide that'll give you my thesis, and then I'll switch to the pictures. But it's this one. I see we are not working, so we'll use the space bar. There. So this is my thesis. It's the only slide you'll have to read, and it's simply this: over the last 20 years, last decade or more, we have been doing something really amazing online, which is discovering a whole new way to build economies, to build societies, to build cultures. It's not through governments. It's not through companies. It's not through even national boundaries. We have found a new way to organize, and that is self-organizing. We live in public, we work in public, and we increasingly innovate in public. And that is the lesson of the web. We have discovered that connecting people together based on their passions and their interests is often a better way than hiring them and giving them a job. And between open source and Wikipedia and all the other examples of peer production, of what's called co-creation on the web, we have invented an extraordinary thing: a new medium, a new social space, and most importantly, a new engine of innovation. And that was all created by computers and networks. We now, for reasons that I'm going to explain to you in just a minute, have the ability to do the same thing, but in the real world, in the world of physical things, in the world of manufacturing, in the world of atoms, not just bits. And that's going to be bigger yet. Good, this is working. So you know, there's two things going on. First of all, we found ways to manufacture that don't require big factories. And second of all, we have all these established web principles that together are creating a new class of product. And this new class of product is, my first book was called The Long Tail, and it's about products that move beyond the mass media model of one size fits all to one size fits one. That's what the web is. The web is nothing but long tail. It's nothing but niche audiences for niche products that define us by our differences, not our commonalities. We have the ability to do the same thing with physical goods now. So what is an industrial revolution? You know, we think of it in terms of the dark satanic mills, the steam and water-powered factories of England and the 1800s. And that was certainly an industrial revolution. But that particular revolution was about bringing people to the factory. We invented machines that could amplify human potential, that could take us from muscle power to brain power. And that could allow countries to compete on a global stage with the power of automation. But it all fell under the domain of the factory, the company. There's a top-down structure. People left the farms and moved to the city because that's where the machines were. That was an industrial revolution that changed the world. It hugely increased the profitability of the people, the health of the people, increased the population. The first industrial revolution is responsible for the modern age in all respects, not just what we make, but how we live, how long we live. Our population is all possible because we amplified human potential with machines, and that was great. But it did come at the cost of the factory model. The idea that we had a mass production model where the biggest factories decided what was made. So the second industrial revolution was the information age. But that was not just the invention of the computer. It was actually two elements. In this case, I've shown you not a computer, but the first laser printer. This was the DeskJet that Apple released in 1985. When you think about it, and we're all too young probably or it's been too long to remember what that was like. But remember the personal computer the computer used to be something that only big companies and governments had. And the personal computer was personal and desktop. Now, the fact that it's personal and desktop didn't tell you anything about how it was going to be used. But what it did is liberated the computer to be used in ways that governments, universities, military, big companies had not thought of. By putting it on the desktop, by making it personal, it became free for anyone to find their own uses. And then once we did the same thing with the printer, we suddenly created desktop publishing. Now, desktop publishing may not sound like a big deal now, but at the time, publishing was a factory business. Only companies that had factories the size of a city block, printers the size of a steam engine, who bought paper by the roll and ink by the barrel, only they could publish. And now that simple invention of a desktop printer allowed anyone to publish. And there was desktop publishing software and the Macintosh and all that. So that was pretty liberating, but you couldn't make very many copies. And then we invented the web and blogs and all that. And now you could not only publish one, but you could publish many. You could press a button and equal the largest media companies in the world in terms of your reach and impact. And today, the web is nothing but that. Today, the web is the tools of mass media given to everybody. It's the democratization of the technology, and that's changed the world. So those two things, putting the power to produce, to prototype, to make one in the hands of everyone, and then the ability to distribute to everyone on the desktop, changes the world. So that was then. And this is now. This is what's changed. Rather than a laser printer, we have a 3D printer. A 3D printer is a device that, so a regular 2D printer, regular printer like your inkjet or whatever, will take an image on the screen and put it on paper, ink on paper. A 3D printer will take an image on the screen, but a 3D image, an object, and it will create an object, like a Star Trek replicator. And this right there is called a MakerBot. I have one in my basement. A lot of my friends have one in their basement. It's a little bit, think of it like the dot matrix printer that you probably had 20 years ago. It's a little bit noisy, it's a little bit slow, it only does one color, maybe two if you add a special head, but it's kind of amazing. My children, when they want a new furniture for their dollhouse, just download it from the internet and press make, and that machine creates it out of plastic. And the next versions will make it out of metal or glass or resins, and they'll do multiple colors, just like the inkjet today does more than the dot matrix printer that you first had. So today we have desktop fabrication. Today we have desktop manufacturing. Now it's an amazing thing. We can download anything we want and make it, but we can only make one, or maybe two. It's pretty slow. Now it's a great way to innovate, but it's a poor way to manufacture. If you want to become an entrepreneur, if you want to make many of something, you still don't have a factory. You need a factory. Well, the second slide, which corresponds to the sort of the blog model, is a screenshot from a company called Alibaba, but there's many like them. And what this represents is the fact that the world's factories have now become open to you. You can go onto a site like Alibaba and you can type in, let's say you want to make a motor. For whatever reason. You've got a toy you want to make, you've 3D printed the prototype, and now you want a motor. How are you going to make motors? The answer is you type into Alibaba, you'll find that there's any number of companies that are hungry for your business. They will take your design files, which you prototyped on your desktop, then they take credit cards, they take PayPal. You don't need a letter of credit, you don't need to be a company, you don't need to meet them. 10 years ago you would have had to fly to Hong Kong, spend God knows how long, drinking and doing karaoke, and I've done this. It involves fish eyeballs at some point in the evening. And that was necessary for them to enter into a relationship with you so they will manufacture your goods. Now it's point and click. Anybody can do it, and they can do it in minutes, and 10 days later, the box arrives at your doorstep. We have the capacity, we have the power, all of us, to make robots work in China for us. We have the capacity to be manufacturers. This is a big deal. In the same way that the blog allowed us all to be publishers, this combination of desktop prototyping and global access to manufacturing for anybody at any scale allows us to replicate the web model with physical goods. So this is how I got into this. This is my grandfather. His name's Fred Hauser, and he was a Swiss immigrant in Los Angeles in the 1920s. He was an engineer, and so like lots of Swiss engineers, he was a little bit of a watchmaker. And Hollywood in those days was a very mechanical business. There were these film drives and gears and tape loops, and it's all sort of spinning wheels and gears and pulleys and things like that. And his job was to design them, and that was a good job for a Swiss engineer. But at night he dreamed of new things. This is him at his workshop, at his drafting table. And if you think about it, if you're in Los Angeles in the 1920s, what you have is the beginnings of prosperity, the beginnings of kind of the suburban ideal, and lots of green lawns. These green lawns, Los Angeles is a very dry climate, and so you need to water these lawns with sprinklers. Now, they just invented sprinklers that could do kind of very cool things with oscillating heads and spreading the water around, but you had to turn them on manually. And what this Swiss watchmaker realized is that what they needed was a clock. They needed a clockwork mechanism. They needed to be programmable, and so that you could program your sprinkler to come on automatically and then go to the beach. So that's what he invented. And he invented the automatic sprinkler system, and this is a picture of him with his first one, and this is his patent. Now this patent is kind of an important element in this, because in those days, and this is the 1950s, but by the way, it defines the 20th century. The only way to get a product to market would be to patent it and then license it to a manufacturer. So he was an inventor, but he couldn't be an entrepreneur because he didn't own a factory. So what he had to do is he had to go through the process of locking up his intellectual property. It's expensive, took time, and then finding someone he could license it to. And he eventually did, and he licensed it to a company called Rainmaster, and these are the kind of ads that came out. And this was a huge success. I mean, this was so unusual. Very few inventors in those days actually made it to market. And he did. And my very, very small family fortune came from, a series of patents on the automatic sprinkler. But it's worth noting that he never became an entrepreneur. He was an inventor, but he wasn't an entrepreneur because he didn't control the means of production. Because he could not make many. He could make one in his workshop, but he couldn't manufacture because he didn't have a factory. And so in the end, what came out, he lost control. And eventually his patent expired. And I remember a day when I went to visit him. His patents were just expiring. He was visiting the company that manufactured, and they were very nice to him. They called him Mr. Hauser. But they didn't know why he was there, and they really wished he wouldn't be there. He wasn't necessary. They got what they needed from him, and they wanted him to just basically go away. They'd send the check. And that's the difference between inventor and entrepreneur. He'd lost control of his invention because the production processes of the 20th century had no place for the little guy. I spent my summers with him. My parents sent me. I was a troubled kid, but they sent me to Grandpa to maybe find some direction. And so this is me at probably about 4 or 5, learning how to do mechanical drawing and to invent things. And this is me at 12, learning how to fabricate. That's a metal lathe. The metal lathe is the most wonderful thing. We'd start one summer. He would say, "This summer, we're going to make an engine. We're going to make a 4-stroke gasoline engine." And I'm like, "Cool." He says, "I've ordered a kit." I'm like, "That's great." So I'd show up, and there's the box, and I'd open it up, and I expected it to be, I built model airplanes, and I expected it to be, a lot of parts, some instructions. They would all have numbers, and you glue them together. And inside the box were these 4 blocks of metal. And I said, "Where are the parts, Grandpa?" And he said, "They're in there. We just have to get them out." And this notion that you could, and at the end of the summer, we had an engine. And this idea that with the right tools, you can start with a block of metal and extract the piston, the cylinder, the crankshaft, all those elements that you can make anything. It's like a sculptor, cutting away the bits of marble that aren't the figure. There's that sense of power over physical objects. It was amazing. But I didn't follow in his footsteps. I didn't become an inventor, or at least not initially. And the reason I didn't is because I didn't want to be an inventor. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And Grandpa never became an entrepreneur. The 20th century model had no place for innovation, in that kind of innovation, the Webb's model of innovation in physical goods. It was too hard. The barriers were too high. This is a movie called Flash of Genius that came out a few years ago. It's about the invention of the intermittent windshield wiper. The intermittent windshield wiper is the wiper that pauses. If it's not raining very hard, just pauses. The movie was about the guy who, very much like my grandfather, invented this in his basement. And just like that, he did it with his kids, and he came up with one. But then he made a mistake that my grandfather didn't make, and that his mistake was that rather than licensing it to Ford or GM, he decided he was going to become an entrepreneur as well. He was going to create his own factory. And so he took out a mortgage, and he rented some space, and he started building a factory, and it was hard. There were assembly lines and all sorts of forklifts and conveyor belts, all that stuff. It took him year after year. So 1961 to 1964, he's building his factory. And he's close to finish in 1964. And it's a rainy day. He leaves the factory, turns the corner, and he sees the new Ford 1964 Mustangs driving down the street to be unveiled. This is in Detroit. It's raining, and the windshield wipers pause. And he realizes that his idea has been stolen and that he's ruined. And so he goes crazy, and the rest of the movie is about his descent into madness, and it's very entertaining. But that was the lesson of the 20th century. Don't dare become an entrepreneur in manufacturing. It's too hard. It's not for you. Instead, patent your stuff. License it. Let someone else make it. Lose control. It's the only way. So here's the good news. That era is over. The The lesson today for the generation growing up with 3D printers and CNC machines and laser cutters and all these other desktop fabrication tools which are now available for less than $1,000, the lesson for them is the same as the lesson for those of us who got our first laser printer or our first dot matrix or our first personal computer, our first web connection, our first blog. And the lesson is, you can do this. You don't need a big company. You don't need permission. You don't need to lock up your ideas and license them. You can go to market. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you can. There's nothing stopping you. We saw what that lesson did on the web. That lesson liberated a generation to become innovative, a generation to let their ideas reach the world, a generation to think for themselves and to imagine that they can make a difference because they had the tools to do so. It empowered a generation to think for themselves. And these same tools, these simple desktop fabrication tools, plus the web's innovation model, are starting to do the same thing in physical space. This is the modern factory. This is called a tech shop. It's what we call a makerspace. And what you think of it a little bit like a gym. So when you think about your gym, where you work out, it's a membership model. So for $100 a month or something like that, you have access to more expensive machines, better machines than you might be able to afford yourself. You have access to trainers. You can work around other people for inspiration. This is the exact same model, but applied to manufacturing. For $100 a month, you become a member of Tech Shop, and there's now a franchise of these around the United States. And you have access to the 3D printer, to the CNC mills, to the laser cutters, to all of the desktop software that allows you to design. You get classes to teach you how to do it. There's trainers who don't help you with the weights, they help you with the CNC. And you're surrounded by people who are making things, who are innovating in manufacturing. The guy here in the front is doing wireless control systems for the smart grid, the electric grid. At the end of the process, right now he's putting together a few prototypes, but at the end of the process, he puts a little sticker that says ABB on them. ABB is the name of a big Swedish engineering firm, and they actually sell his products. Now, when you buy a wireless controller for the smart grid from ABB, you probably assume it's made by a big Swedish factory, but it's not. It's made by a couple guys in Tech Shop. They're entrepreneurs. They're entrepreneurs who control their own production. It's not selling in the millions, but it doesn't have to. It's selling in the thousands. And what they've got is a low barrier to entry. They're able to start their company and run their company out of what's basically a gym, but for manufacturing. The guy behind is doing a synthetic diamond mill. It's a way to do vapor deposition and potentially come up with an industrial technology that used to cost millions of dollars. He's now developing it in his spare time at Tech Shop. And in the back of the building, which you can't see, there's a lunar lander. So yes, this is people dreaming of going to space and realizing their dreams, possibly, in the back of this shop. So this is a model that couldn't have existed a few years ago. What this tells you is that if you create these makerspaces, and by the way, here's a map of the makerspaces around the world. If you create these makerspaces, these become places where people start to apply their open innovation model to physical stuff. They start to realize their dreams, and what's great about it is once they make one, they know how to make many. They know how to go into production. They know that it's just simply a matter of pointing and clicking and finding some, access to global supply chains is now simply a matter of having a web connection. So right now in the United States, the Obama administration is putting 1,000 makerspaces into high schools. Right now in high schools, you have art class and you have computer class. In art class, you learn to draw. In computer class, you learn how to use Excel and PowerPoint. When I was a kid, we had something called shop class, where you would learn to do manufacturing. There would be a bandsaw, and there'd be a drill press, and maybe a lathe of some sort. And the idea back in the 1980s, when I was in high school, was that manufacturing was part of a nation's strength. That being able to make things was a valuable and honorable career. And then what happened is that we lost that. It became no longer the path to the middle class. America became too expensive, failed to innovate. And so manufacturing went to countries like Korea, like China, like Vietnam, like Malaysia. The labor arbitrage, the sort of globalization, Tom Friedman's flat world, moved manufacturing to where the cost was lowest. And shop class disappeared. And people no longer saw manufacturing as something America could do. It became services and IT and all that. It was about using your brain, and that's great. The economy did well, but we lost an important skill. Real countries make stuff. And for a while there, we lost the ability to make stuff because we felt we couldn't compete on labor terms. What we're now discovering is that we can use all of the lessons, all of the tools of the digital revolution, we can now apply them back to manufacturing and rebalance that equation. Right now, and I'll show you in a bit, I run a factory as part of a side project. I run a factory down in San Diego where we make electronic parts. You probably think that America can't make electronic parts, and it's true that America doesn't make most of its computers these days, and Apple certainly does its production in China. But that's at scale of millions. At scale of thousands or tens of thousands for niche products, we can do electronic manufacturing fine. We buy our pick-and-place machines for the same price the Chinese do. Our labor rates are trivial because it's such an automated process. We actually have discovered that digital technology applied to manufacturing levels the playing field. More to the point, we have a superior innovation model. Our R&D costs are lower because we use the web. I'll explain that in a minute. But the lesson that people are learning now is that the act of creating a product in your mind, on the screen, and then on your desktop is exactly the same as going into full manufacturing. The same files are used by the smallest desktop machines and the biggest factories. The way we put it is that the global supply chains are now impedance matched to the individual. That means they are scale agnostic. They work in batches of 10, they work in batches of 1 million. The same file format across all from the smallest production to the largest. That's incredibly empowering. That's what the internet did with digital information. HTML, PDF, PostScript, all those file formats that worked as well on your printer as they do on the global audience of the web is now applying to physical goods as well. You can upload your products to these services like Shapeways or Pinocchio and have them made at incredibly high quality and show up at your doorstep a week later. You don't even need desktop fabrication tools. You simply need to point and click. We saw what this did in the music industry. Once upon a time in the music industry, you needed to have a label, you needed to have a recording studio, you needed to have a marketing budget, and then came digital, and you could do it all on your desktop. A single laptop could record, could remix, could market, could distribute. It's incredibly empowering to change the industry. And now you can do the same thing, point and click, and you're in the manufacturing business, thanks to services like this. So, here's what happened. 20 years ago, we all became publishers. Once you got a blog, you're a publisher. Now we're all designers. We have the capacity to make anything. We don't have the skills necessarily, and that's why we need to learn this. And I would propose that, for the future of schools, we take our computer class and turn it into design class. There's tools like this that that are free. This is what CAD tools look like. And what's great about these CAD tools right now is that they have a menu item, and that menu item doesn't say print, it says make. That's incredibly powerful. On your word processor, when you pick print, you take an image on the screen and put it on paper. You can make a physical object, but it's just paper. Now you go to the same menu item and you pick make, and you get the physical object. Maybe you have a desktop, 3D printer, maybe you don't. Maybe it's just uploading it to a service. But think of what you do with a photo right now. You can decide to print your photo on your printer, or you can upload it to a service to be printed at higher quality. It's easy, it's just a matter of clicking. You can do this with 3D objects right now. These tools are free. They're being used by children. This is empowering in a way the digital revolution was empowering 20 years ago. This is going to change a generation, and they're going to feel that they can do it. So I told you the story of my grandfather and his sprinkler, and I asked myself, what would Grandpa do today? I know that back then he felt he had to patent and license And that was no tragedy. He was a success, but he wasn't an entrepreneur. What would he do today? So I thought rather than imagine, I would just do it. So I said, well, let's reinvent the sprinkler today. But let's do it in a web way. So first of all, what does a web way mean? Well, first of all, you do it in collaboration. So by the way, I don't know anything about sprinklers. I don't even have a lawn. But Grandpa made a sprinkler, so I had to make a sprinkler. So I went online and found communities where they were talking about using technology in gardening, and found some people to collaborate with. And we ended up with something we call Open Sprinkler. Now, why does the world need a new sprinkler system? Well, this sprinkler system is connected to the web. So if you forgot to turn on your sprinkler, and it's turned out to be a hot day, you just open up your phone and you can turn it on. Or if you programmed it to rain, to sprinkle tomorrow, but you now know it's going to rain tonight, it will automatically look at the weather report and turn itself off. You can measure your soil moisture. You can measure the temperature connected to sensors. And not only that, but it's open, so anybody can add more sensors if they want. This is based on the Arduino open source hardware platform, and it's, by the way, super cheap. Unlike the commercial sprinklers that where you have to pay a subscription fee to get weather information, ours is free. Now, I'm not saying this is going to change the world. I'm just saying that this is possible. I know nothing about sprinklers, and in about 6 months of work, I'm now in the sprinkler business. Is it going to be the world's best sprinkler? Are there any others that are better? And, absolutely, there are others that are better. But the point is that people can now build on our design and make it better because it's open. Now, this is just a kind of a thought experiment. But what it represents is a new class of device. And these are classes of physical devices that are created by users, not by manufacturers. And because they're built around communities, they're designed to be open. And when they're open, they get better automatically for free. The class of devices this falls into is what we call the Internet of Things. You've probably heard something about the Internet of Things before. It's a little bit like the ubiquitous computing thing that you hear a lot about in Asia. But it's basically the notion that if the first version of the web was that people were connecting together, the next version of the web is going to be devices connecting together. Already our phones connect, but the idea of smart homes, about smart cars, increasingly smart bodies, where the devices we carry on us, our watches, I'm carrying various sensors that measure my activity, and my scale tweets my weight to my wife, and when I sleep, I've got a headband that tells me all the different ranges of sleep, and they're all connected to the web. So what we're seeing now is the ability for cheap sensors, cheap processing, and ubiquitous wireless connectivity to connect devices for reasons that we don't really know what we're going to do with them. But we do know we have the capacity. And what we get now is the opportunity for regular people to figure out what to do with smart devices. Think about the web. The engineers invented HTTP and TCP/IP and HTML, all these standards. But we, the regular people of the world, figured out what to do with it. We filled it with our ideas, with our content, with our own needs and applications. And now we have the capacity to do the same thing with physical devices. So, this is all you need. You need these open computing platforms. Arduino is one of them. Sensors, thanks to the phones in our pocket, we now have an accelerating pace of innovation in sensors, in embedded processors, in wireless, in memory, in embedded systems. What's going on right now, thanks to Samsung and Apple and others, is basically taking this sort of Internet of Things technology and making it so cheap that anybody can build it. The first PCs, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in the Homebrew Computing Club, were possible because Intel made a processor chip, available to the public for a few dollars. And no one knew what you would do with it, but Steve Jobs and Wozniak decided to make a computer, and that became the personal computer revolution. Cheap technology in the hands of innovative people can change the world. We've seen it happen once, it'll happen again. Thanks to what's going on with smartphones, all those ubiquitous computing, all those Internet of Things technologies are becoming cheaper, faster than any technology we've ever seen in history. What's going on right now with sensors right now dwarfs what's going on with processors, with memory, with bandwidth, and everything else in terms of the pace of innovation. The economies of scale of the smartphone revolution are creating a wave of of ubiquitous technology that is going to allow this generation of innovators to come up with new devices. And those new devices are going to be connected to the web, they're going to be connected to each other, and they're going to be driven a little bit by big companies who have their ideas, but a lot more by individuals who have better ideas, just like the web. So, we're already seeing open source thermostats, open source power meters, open source appliance controllers. What's so powerful about them being open source? Well, simply that they're an invitation to innovate. What they say is, you don't need to work for a big company, you don't need to work for a university, you can do it yourself. It's free and open and easy to use. That's what open innovation does in the physical space. So this is an ugly, ugly screen. This is an ugly screen for a purpose. Remember how the web started. It started with us making ugly pages. This is GeoCities. These were the ugliest pages of all. I picked the ugliest GeoCity page I could find, but I'm sure you've seen others. So we forget about that. That was a necessary adolescent phase before we got good at it. So rather than the sort of adolescent, messy period leads to the sophisticated glossy period, and the same thing. So call it the GeoCities of things. Russell Davies, one of my colleagues in the UK, decided he decided he was going to make his Internet of Things. In London, where he lives, there are bicycles that you can rent. But you never know whether there's going to be a bicycle available in your local stand. Now, you can go onto a website, but it's a hassle to kind of open up a web browser and find out. So he created a little map connected to an Arduino, and the Arduino is connected to the web. And what that just tells him is where the bikes are available in his neighborhood. And this only makes sense for him. So Samsung will not invent a bicycle finder box for Russell Davies. Only Russell can invent this. Or maybe only a community of people like this can invent this, because it's not for an audience of millions. It's for an audience of hundreds or thousands, and there's an unlimited number of them. That's the long tail of stuff. This is an example of just another kind of application. These cards right here have sensors and little wireless connectors. And what you do is you put them on things you value. So let's say let's say you're trying to eat less. So you put a card, which is sticky, on the refrigerator, and it'll just measure how many times you open the door. And you can track that, and maybe your family can track that, your friends can track that. And if you want to do less of it, it'll tweet, and it'll say, if you only opened the door 5 times today, and it was 10 times yesterday, your friends will say, way to go. And if you did it 12 times, they'll say, open the door a lot there. Or put it on your aged parents' pill bottles, so you can see if they're adhering to their meds and taking their drugs at the right time. Or one guy puts it on the bow of his violin, so he can track how long he practices and measures that. What's great about this is you put it on the things you value. We don't know what you want. We don't know what you're trying to do more or less of. Only you know. But these sort of Internet of Things devices allow you to apply information, data, technology where it's most meaningful to you. So I want to end with just this last note, which is, what does this mean for the future of companies and the shape of the 21st century industrial economy? These are 2 guys. Ronald Coase, the University of Chicago Nobel laureate, came up with a theory of the firm. He said, companies exist to minimize transaction costs. That means we work for a company, we have a job, and we're employed, and we work under one roof because it makes it easier to figure out who does what. That person does account receivable, that person does account payable. You know how to get things done and it's easy to talk to them. The guy on the right is Bill Joy. He co-founded Sun Microsystems. And he said something quite challenging. He said, whoever you are, the smartest people in the world don't work for you. Now this is troubling. It's true, by the way. Whoever you are, whoever your employees are, they're not the smartest people in the world for that function. Because statistically, the smartest people probably live in another country or aren't available or whatever. So Ronald Coase says, companies work when the employees work for you, and Bill Joy says the best people don't work for you. It's a problem. So this is the solution. This is the cover of Make magazine, which is the sort of the Bible, the maker movement, which is what I'm talking about here. And the guy there is Jordi Munoz, and he's my co-founder of 3D Robotics, my robotics company. I just wanted to finish with the story of him. I started a community, a social network, to figure out how to do this stuff. And what happened is we eventually made these, this is what we make. We make aerial robots, that's multicopters and planes, and they're called drones. And he helped create these in this community. And we got better and better at them, and eventually we decided we were going to release the products. And these are the interfaces, and you give them missions, and they all fly by themselves, and it's cool stuff. And so we decided to start a company. And this is our first factory floor. It's a garage. And at this point, I asked Jordy a little something about himself. I said, Jordy, if I'm going to start a company with you, tell me a little something about your background. At the time I first met him, he was a 19-year-old high school student living in Tijuana, Mexico. Today, this is what our factory looks like. This is just one of our pick-and-place floors. It's now a multi-million-dollar high-tech electronic production line. Jordy is CEO, and he still hasn't been to college. 10 years ago, if the editor-in-chief of Wired was going to start a high-tech drone company with somebody, he would not have picked a Mexican teenager living in Tijuana. And yet, this was the bright guy for the job. He found me. I didn't find him. I set up a community. The smartest people in the world came to the community because it touched on their passions, because they wanted to do it, because they were driven by their curiosity and their deepest ambitions. He didn't come to the community because he wanted a job. He came to the community because he wanted to change the world. And when I picked him to be my co-founder, I didn't care what school he'd been to, what language he spoke, what country he lived in, what degrees he had or didn't have, and what his professional experience had been. All I cared about was what could he do. That is the solution to Joy's paradox. Today, the smartest people in the world can work for us. Maybe not as our employees, maybe not under one roof, maybe not in our companies, but together in a community, working on something that they are driven by their passions, not their paycheck. That, I think, is the shape of the 21st century innovation model. And that is now going to apply to manufacturing, not just the web. So the slogan that we end on is, atoms are the new bits, that the innovation models that we saw change the world in the digital space with information, with bits, is now applying to a world much bigger, the world of atoms, the world of manufacturing, the world of real stuff. And this, I think, is going to reshape the world and invent a class of products that we can only dream of today. Thank you very much.